My aim is to understand the theory of Jacques Lacan by pushing him to the breaking point. My justification for this is that Lacan pushed himself to a specific limit or margin where his literal speech, his dire, so to speak, became a meteor, a fragment. We can call this a tessera, a token that, like the ancient ceramic tokens of friendship, which were broken at the point where friends parted ways, created a fracture that was shaped by random chance, but was used later to authenticate the rejoining of the two halves. This, I claim, is the logic of instrumental convergence, a combination of chance and necessity that is, I also claim, the only basis for doing theory in psychoanalysis. This lacks Karl Popper's principle of the modus tolens, or refutability. But because the theorizing subject cannot claim to be a non-subject, there is no externality by which a claim may be shown to fall. The subject, who is also a theorist, must, as Lacan advised, convert to a system based on non-orientation under the conditions of self-intersection. That is, the theorizing subject must look for anomalies, cracks, and the paradoxes that populate the impossible real. The difference between psychoanalysis and science hinges on the issue of the subject wishing to know the subject. In the face of self-reference, criticism has but one choice, which is what Dan Collins advises in his essay on how to do Lacanian criticism using Hitchcock movies as examples. The key to doing criticism by the cut productively is to recognize the particular kind of cut you use and to be aware of its historical origins. This is the katagraphic cut, which Lacan directly references in Seminars 9 and 14 on identification and the logic of fantasy. The katagraphic cut goes back at least to biblical times, when Jesus employed it to absolve the woman accused of adultery. Lacan's reference is to the injunction of Popilius, which is never referenced by any Lacanians I know of. We move from a picturesque version of Lacan to what I call the topological Lacan. By picturesque, the kind of perspectives created to compare Lacan to past and contemporary thinkers, Hegel, Kant, de Sade, and Spinoza mostly for the past, Derrida, Badiou, Deleuze mostly for the present. As scholarly as these comparisons seem to be, and I suspect that a good number of them are done for tenure-track purposes, they are criticism by punctuation. They try to explain Lacan by additions, captions, and commentaries. They do not go to the heart of the matter, the heart that Lacan defines unambiguously as topological. Logic, Lacan says, is about structure, and structure is about topology. There is no other way to do criticism by the cut in Lacanian theory than to address the issue of projective geometry. Until I read Dan Collins' work, I was not familiar with the terms criticism by punctuation or criticism by the cut. I never doubt Dan Collins, but I did want to know more of the history behind these terms. So I turned to my old AI friend, ChatGPT, for a basic Reader's Digest definition. I will have my AI voice, James, read you what Chat said, one bot to another. I asked James to paraphrase, and I will clip down his summary.
Yes, I am familiar with these two terms used in literary criticism. Criticism by punctuation refers to the practice of examining a literary work primarily through an analysis of its grammar, syntax, and punctuation. On the other hand, criticism by the cut refers to an approach in which the critic focuses on the overall structure and organization of a work, the way in which the work as a whole is put together.
I think it's time for all good Lacanians to realize that they must make the choice that Lacan consistently made, that in the process of piling things on, one must focus on the question of structure, which is the question of the cut, and how it serves to authenticate the human experience as psychoanalytical, even though we cannot observe the human subject with traditional scientific objectivity. For Lacan, structure always means topology. Topology is about finding self-intersection or self-knowledge in the face of non-orientation. Lacan's genius was to say that non-orientation is not an obstacle, but a key. If criticism by the cut means anything for doing Lacanian theory, it means understanding Lacan's own highly visual thinking in terms of it, which is to say that we must bring topology to those mathemes and formulas we have so often found to be impenetrable. The one on top is my favorite, since it is found in several key positions in Lacan's writing, but also in slightly different variations. The formula for metaphor certainly doesn't look topological, but I will argue that not only is it topological, but that its topology is foundational. This amounts to saying that topology and subjectivity are not two separate things, but that topology is something that is subjective in the first place. If we consider topology to be unthinkable and real, it's because it in fact is the way the real manifests itself, with numbers that refuse to be numbers, and forms that refuse us a space to step back and take a look at them. If it's impossible to paraphrase or caption a projective geometry form, it's because the form is the impossible real of our own subjectivity, and we don't have a choice of doing criticism by punctuation in psychoanalysis. There is only a criticism by the cut. But how do we do this criticism by the cut? This does not seem to be an option that many Lacanian scholars are willing to take. First of all, it requires engaging with a topology that most Lacanians confuse for rubber sheet topology, also known as affine geometry, or Euclid without angles and distances. Projective geometry is truly two-dimensional. There is no place to step back and take a view of any form. The form and the space of the form are the same. The container is the same as the contained. But we can use what are called immersion forms of projective topologies, and by cutting into them, draw conclusions about the logic of those cuts. Such is the case with the bagel that is the immersion form of the torus, the 3D of the 2D. If we cut into the bagel just so, a cut that actually has the name of the Wheeler-Sow cut, we get two intersecting circles that are actually Euler circles, not to be confused with a Venn diagram. In art, these are the Vesica Pisces, made famous by religious art. In logic, however, they are the condition of union without intersection, what Lacan correctly identifies as the condition of symmetrical difference. What is symmetrical difference? It is a logical relation, to be sure, but what is more useful for us is that it is a universal motif in folklore, literature, and visual arts, where it marks out the situation of instrumental convergence. This is where the lack or absence of something is followed by the recovery of something else made possible by that absence. The process of recovery is usually based on random chance, luck, or the unexpected. Because it converges on a discovery that would have been impossible without the prior lack, the convergence is realized as an instrumental result, a kind of action at a distance. Learning about projective geometry is the same thing as learning about ethnology and cultural formations. It's not just all about points, lines, and planes. When Lacan looked at topology, he always took care to talk about the subject. But Lacan's subject is the subject ideal, not the ideal subject of literature and art. The universal model has to maintain a certain propriety of relations between fundamentals such as the demand for recognition of the other, which is the essence of repetition that creates the tube of the torus, and the voids of the torus that tell us all about the small object A, which cannot be found in Euclid or even in our parallax experience of the visible world. But they nonetheless abound in experience, where we find them at the level of existential as well as material lacks and surpluses, spatial voids that abound in art and architecture, and temporal delays, which are the essence of poetry and narrative. These ethnological features, lack, surplus, spatial voids, and temporal delays, link us to the material world where we found counterparts that we can study in lieu of Karl Popper's scientific propositions. These are places that are inherently fractured. Hence, we are using a methodology of the cut, or what in projective geometry is called non-orientation. I call them Escher formations because the Dutch artist M.C. Escher gave us the best example when he drew staircases that went up and down at the same time. In these concrete examples of non-orientation, we are able to revise our thinking about how Lacan requires us to look at the material world in terms of fracture, the katagraphic cut, and the tessera or me-dear themes of parting and reunion, the symmetrical difference of instrumental divergence and convergence. By popular culture, I want to use something really popular, where supply and demand, the spatial void, and temporal delay not only make sense, but are the essential ingredients. This is the modern department store, something that took off at the end of the 19th century, and by the 1930s had become the prototype for Western consumerism, recentered over the idea of the unnecessary, which is to say, surplus object. Architecture in this case could be said to be that which cultivates the sense of the lacking subject, the subject who desires, in terms of appearance, behavior, and belief structure, or as Lacanians say, the logic of fantasy. If fantasy's main function in psychoanalysis is to cover over inconsistencies in the symbolic, places where the real pokes through, we could say that the architecture of the department store is to accommodate the chains of signifiers, organize them into floors, departments, and displays of metonymically linked commercial goods. We see the signifying chain in plain view if we pay a special attention to the way the department store uses changes of level to shift between signifying chains, and how elevators and later escalators serve to make these changes. Pay particular attention to the function of the void. Literally, it is the structural support that separates the floors from each other, but it is also a plenum or hidden passageway, much like the pneumatic tube system used by the classic stores to circulate messages, purchase records, materials, and cash throughout the building. Here is a picture of the other of the department store, the employee who, without opening any of the containers coming down the pneumatic tubes, simply reroutes them, sends them on their way. What is intriguing about this photo is that opposite the phone, which makes some sense, there is a large wooden box with 6 cubby holes, making no sense, next to something that looks like a pencil sharpener. It's as if some Lacanian had slipped into the photo archive and photoshopped an object that has an inside but no real outside, whose openings imply the existence of some secret code or protocol by which the small glass and felt capsules enter into a space that is both too small and too large for them. The too small and too large clues are critical. Without any idea of content, the too large and too small are the function of extimacy, that is the essence of the real. This tallies with another famous too small and too large representation of the machine of the real. In a factory, you aren't supposed to see the gears, let alone inhabit them as Charlie Chaplin does in Modern Times. But in the department store, they are the way that instrumental convergence actually converges, instrumentally, on the production of surprise, delight, and astonishment, always with hidden cost working silently and invisibly in the background. In this Chaplin film, we see Marx more clearly than if we had done a close reading of Das Kapital. The subject is taken up by the gears of the instrument, made to perform aphanesis in the face of the thing, the other, that is the ideal other, because its gears mesh perfectly, and it is accountable because the teeth of the gears are literally countable. In psychoanalysis, we know how to count. It's not just one number after another. It's the way that each number refers back to the system, the origin of the system, the one before it was one, or as Oscar Levant put it, Doris Day before she was a virgin. This originary one is all hat and no ranch, as they say in Texas. But for Lacan, the ranch is obliged to circle back to the hat, the term that is not yet, and hence too much, lack and surplus combined. If this standing out definition of the unary trait rings any bells for you, let me invite you to consider in some considerable detail my department store thesis, where I go to the edge of Lacan to find the inner Lacan, the place where theory breaks, inevitably for the bad before it breaks for the good, where we learn about architecture at the same time we learn about psychoanalysis. My method is actually officially a part of the mathematician's toolbox. It's what you do when you face an impasse. You construct an ersatz trial balloon and see where it goes. In this case, we intentionally search out the impasse, the condition of non-orientation, or what I call the Escher formation. The payoff I'm looking for is the way the department store inadvertently spills the beans about the unary trait, and in the process gives away the secret plans for the construction of metaphor. Lacan's graphic imagination calls for an even more graphic extension of theory through the architecture of the department store, where the hope is that not only will you find the unary trait in the symptoms department, but you will be able to buy it on sale. I fell in love with department stores while quite young, not as long ago as this photo dated 1925, but in the 50s, when every good boy goes with his mother to get clothes for school. Bon Marché became Ivy's, down the street from Winners, all owned by the Jewish families who had saved much of the South by coming down after the Civil War to restore commerce and build up the architecture of towns. Naturally, when I began to travel, I was attracted to department stores where not only you could replenish your touristic wardrobe, but get a good lunch, practice your limited French, Italian, or in this case German without being embarrassed, and learn about this Western architectural tradition. There's no beating La Samaritaine in Paris, where you were once able to visit the rooftop cafe and take in a panoramic view of the city annotated by paintings on the railings that put names to what you saw. The word luxury used to mean lechery in Old English, but its Latin root luxus simply meant excess, but in excess there is still the sense of transgression and guilt, which is quickly suppressed if you have any practice at all being rich, even if just in your imagination. It's the suppression part that interests us Lacanians, since the expression guilty pleasures is really all one word. You don't have jouissance without the feeling that you shouldn't, or as we say in the South, if you want to have a watermelon that really tastes good, you have to steal it. The U.S. can claim special access to this idea, since early department stores were designed like the palaces of the original robber barons, such as John Astor, Leland Stanford, Henry Frick, and Cornelius Vanderbilt, and the somewhat more benevolent Andrew Carnegie. John Wanamaker failed as a brickmaker, thank goodness, but started out as an employee in a clothing store. He preserved his sense of modesty by being the first full-time paid bookkeeper of the fledgling YMCA organization, and was also a lay minister in the Presbyterian Church. Hardly the stuff of a robber baron, but his architectural taste didn't show it. The 20th century version of Wanamaker's invited its patrons to delay in a temporal void by looking at a spatial void, replete with balconies, a large eagle, and an organ that gave concerts at noon. In other notoriously Protestant cities, such as Helsinki, the department store was where you were allowed to spend that bit of money God had decided you deserved. This Christian algorithm meant that thriftiness was next to godliness, and unlike the specialty shops, luxury goods were repackaged as bargains at discount prices. The essence of the department store can thus be found in the basement, such as the most famous basement at Filene's in Boston, where a system of markdowns forced bargain hunters to calculate the precise minimax point where the price would just barely escape the notice of some other shopper. This is the essence of Marx's idea of exchange value. Not a literal number, but an isomeric number, one that is always a ratio of something and something else. In the American Southwest, Indian cultures seem to know a lot about isomerics, where this term applies to the zigzag designs on their pottery. This is not simply decorative, since the value of bowls and jars is their hollowness. While it's waiting to be filled, the bowl or jar uses the isomeric design to bring life and death into close proximity. There is almost an overlap. The idea is that what is long one way is short another way, that the fold creates opportunities to jump across from one to the other. There are a number of other special terms for this idea. I won't go into them now, but the words cathesis, tessera, katagraph, and so on are like the rules of the game, the chessboard before the game has started. In all games, but especially in chess, the rules and the games have an interesting interplay that involves the zigzag, so let me quickly summarize. We begin with the rules that reveal that they are just the outer layer of a different set of rules that we will discover in the course of playing the game. As the game develops, these new rules, which are discovered in the context of the completely accidental back and forth of the game, where each player upsets the balance of the starting position of the pieces, begin to emerge, but they can never be fixed in one point. They are always a ratio, a relation of players playing, of upsets, of accidents, and the intersection of wrong and right turns. Although no two games are alike, we can try to formalize some of this with things like the Queen's Gambit, or Bingo, or the Blackmar-Deemer Gambits. I love these names. They are like rules inside of rules, the rules that evolve and will always have this evolving nature. We can see how isomeric pottery takes this rule game ratio and formalizes it, relates it to the voids, and even thematizes the idea of waiting in the empty bowl or jar, just to talk about life and death relations. It must have been important for them to make so many designs, so it should be important to us as students of Lacan to formalize just what is going on. Here's my crack at it. Science is nothing if not reductionistic, Lacan says somewhere. And the point of reductionism is not to find a final fixed point where every problem is solved, but to see a relationship more clearly. I don't want to say that things are as simple as 1, 2, 3, but isomeric pottery is, on one level, something pretty basic, so I am somewhat justified in saying that in number 1 we have a cut, in number 2 we see the cut in terms of the spaces it has divided, in their parallel relation, and in number 3 we have altered one of the spaces so that the path is longer, but the access from side to side has made it possible to jump from one space to the other without changing direction. That's the cleverness of the zigzag. It is about proximities that don't seem to be possible, and for the Indians of the American Southwest, these proximities were opportunities to renew relations between the living and the dead. The trick is to see how and why the combination of divergence and convergence becomes instrumental convergence. This is a combination of the well-known biological phenomenon of exaptation, or emergence, and the principle of sorites, where amidst a random series of events or objects, a pattern emerges suddenly and surprisingly. Zizek talks about sorites under the heading of 1 grain more or 1 hair less, but never actually gives us the name of this logical paradox, of how something becomes something when, just a moment before, it was nothing. The key is to understand how this question has been asked in the past by people who were seemingly not invested in discovering the science of psychoanalysis. In the American Southwest, again, it's one of my favorite sources, petroglyphs used a variety of designs to attempt crossings between life and death in an instrumentally convergent way. When we look straight at these figures, we forget to look behind us to see what the images themselves looked at, which is the range of mountains across a wide valley. Aha! The petroglyph is itself an attempt to turn a straight line into a zigzag, to create an affordance. It doesn't really matter what the design is or how well it's drawn. The point is to connect with something as distant as a far mountain range to bring it nearer. Whatever works is the principle of artistic excellence, just as in any game, a goofy or clumsy move is judged to be brilliant if it wins. Winning is the antagonistic zigzag that upsets the balance, yet brings the unexpected within reach. When we find isomerics all over the world, which we do, and all over history, which we do, we realize just how many things are isomeric that we had not noticed before. This image of Hercules taking a sea voyage in a pot pretty much sums up the situation. He is finding a place to cross over to Hades in the designs that connect the two circles, making a long trip into a shorter one. We shouldn't believe it unless we can see it, or rather until we can confound what we think we see with the truth about structure. In the Ames window experiment, a forced perspective maquette with a ruler placed on what seems to be its windowsill rotates 360 degrees, but the forced perspective makes the window seem to move between a left and right position, the same edge always facing us. In reality, the printed image we think we see is really two images, one on either side of the thin board. But we cancel this out in an effort to enjoy what in psychology is called, thanks to Jean Piaget, object permanence. This strong demand makes us ignore the fact that the maquette is rotating, not oscillating. So when the ruler appears to pass like a ghost through the solid surface, we are amazed. Here we have a demonstration that amounts to a scientific proof, a proof based on our own body's conflict between what it experiences and what it believes about that experience. The conflict is what we see, not the window and the ruler. This is how we substitute the tessera, the katagraphic cut, for Karl Popper's principle of refutability, the modus tolens. In a way, we know something is happening because we cannot help but fall for it every time we see the ruler pass through the window. The tolens, or fall, of our proof is that we experience the katagraphic cut directly. It is in our nature. The next step is to see how the fold extends and intends at the same time, while the thread remains in tension. This is possibly the most famous story in architecture, a story in a story, since the labyrinth built to imprison the Minotaur was monstrous in its own right. To ensure the hero Theseus could enter and exit safely, his beloved Ariadne supplied a silver thread to guide him. Many, if not all Lacanians, who have rightly regarded the labyrinth as a topological figure, have trouble figuring out the role of Ariadne's thread. For example, Mae Wegener thinks it might have to do with Freud's grandson's Fort and Da experience with a spool of yarn, rehearsing his mother's absence. But this misses the point that the Fort and Da are more like the folds of the labyrinth. The thread is always in tension. It can't be otherwise, even when the child is throwing the spool out of the crib. Also, many have been mystified that there are no choices to make between turning left or right in this meander that is not a maze. Wegener can't connect how the tension of the thread was to keep track of in and out, even when the pathway alternates between centripetal tightening and centrifugal loosening. This combination of a constant tension in the face of the back and forth is not just universal for architecture. It is key to the diagram that is Lacan's version of instrumental convergence, and I would dare to say that psychoanalysis itself is this architectural combination of the zigzag conversation, which appears to be a dialectical alternation between two speakers, the two egos of Lacan's L schema, and the constant tension of the unconscious in the role of Ariadne's thread. As we know from good clinicians such as Bruce Fink and Russell Grigg, the combination of the divergence of the latter with the convergence of the former, as a kind of game whose rules are not known until the end, becomes an instrumental convergence. The term instrumental is appropriate to the way that the unconscious works as a kind of golem or automaton, always alert, even when, or should I say especially when, we are not paying attention. Its constant tension creates the moments where the unconscious breaks through in slips of the tongue or bungled explanations. The L schema allows us to think about the Ames window demonstration of the isomeric point of emergence in ways that connect to ethnology. In the 50s, Robert Graves proposed an astonishing, if somewhat fanciful account of how, in Genesis, there are miracles that constitute openings where the divine world briefly connects with the human world. Graves' thesis was that this had nothing to do with theology or belief, but with structure. The Hebrew scholars had borrowed narrative materials from nearby cultures, who had produced a series of icons to tell the story of human origins. The problem was that these cultures arranged their image on tiles sequenced as what is called a boustrophodon, or the way an ox plows a field, left to right to left to right, and so on, just like the Ames window. The Hebrew scribes, however, always read and wrote from right to left. This meant that every other line of the borrowed images would be read in reverse order, and the connections between the ends of the lines would always be wrong, requiring the scribes to invent workarounds, which were like the ruler passing through the window frame in the Ames experiment. Just so, in the telling of stories, or, I would argue, the construction of even modern institutions like the department store. The charm of the department store is that its systematic presentations conceal bargains, or at least what the shopper thinks are bargains, and these all relate to the basement of the department store, where the real bargains are to be found, but also where it is possible to return something you've bought. This concealment of value, added to the promise of infinite exchange, is also what makes a good story. Lacanians are some of the few people who are able to say that they know what this universal key actually is. It's the Object Petit, something you don't look for, as Picasso said, you just find. The Object Petit is built into the department store idea. As the Lacanian theorist Samo Tomčić has put it, the little a is not anything that can be supported by Kant's transcendental aesthetic or Euclid's 13 books. It is not just non-Euclidean and therefore topological. It is non-visual, non-parallax, extraterritorial. In my ersatz way, I would go further to say that the Object Petit is evidence that we cannot do without projective geometry, not just because Lacan said so, but because we are critics of the cut who must march to the edge of Lacan and study the frontline trenches. We must venture into the no man's land and mingle with the deserters of all nationalities who dodge the bombs and eke off a living eating dead animals. Like Tarkovsky's Stalker or Star Trek's Captain Kirk, we must go where no one has gone before, critically at least. There's lots to say about Bergdorf Goodman's famous glamorous window displays, but all this aside, it has been used as a film location for some notable scenes, and in a spooky way, the situation of the scene tells us something about the architecture and the department store idea in general. The exchange of energies between the site of the building and the situation of the fictional plot is a two-way street. For example, without the simultaneity of the existential surplus lack, the spatial void, and the temporal delay, this scene from Hitchcock's North by Northwest cannot be successfully analyzed. That is, we could not connect it to Lacan's theory of metaphor, which involves the suppression, that is Roger Thornhill's misunderstanding of the relation of his gesture to the bellboy's page, call for Mr. Kaplan, and the spatial void, that is his abduction to a mansion on Long Island run by the KGB, or the temporal void, that is the absence of the hero in the classic literary formula of the catabasis. Thornhill wants to send a message to his mother. What a Lacanian thing to do. But he calls the page boy to do this just at the same moment the page boy is paging a Mr. Kaplan. This has been a trick to find out who Kaplan actually is, and KGB spies stand at the side to see who will respond. Since they have never seen Kaplan before, they will take Thornhill's gesture as a proof that he is Kaplan, but Kaplan is really a fiction that the FBI has invented to lead the KGB on a wild goose chase. So Thornhill will find it difficult to prove he is not someone who doesn't exist. This brings the department store in close contact with Lacan's most intimate theories about human subjectivity. We are looking at Ariadne's thread, a tension that is able to cross over an impossible gap, a portal between being and speaking. There is a bargain basement and a bargain in the basement in Lacanian theory. It's not just in architecture, it is architecture. It is an isonomic point, just like the hole in the torus, which is the middle of the bagel, but in the 2D torus, the motive for repetition. In the department store, you go to the basement for returns, and in Lacan, you go to the foundations for the place where the repressed is returned, always, of course, in reverse. This convenient void is all about circulation, and wherever you find a circuit you know you are on to the death drive, that is the master circuit of all circuits. Completing the circuit is always problematic in Lacanian theory. The little a stands in the way of a complete refund, so you follow the catch-22 small print to convert from Euclid to Desargues, one of the founders of projective geometry, and in the process discover that there is a mirror stage for adults as well as first-time infants. This is due to the fact that the mirror is not a reflection, but geometrically speaking, a cut. So returning is always a case of reversal, as Magritte emphasizes by putting Poe's only novel, which involves chiasmus, the narrative version of the mirror, on the sill. The department store's circulatory system can be explained in ways that would suit a literary critic as well as a clinical psychologist. If we think about the way the elevator gets from one floor to the other, in what is basically a stacking system of the symbolic, each floor being a kind of standalone discourse, a once upon a time announced by the elevator operator who would call out the goods to be found at each stop. If we are readers of Murakami novels, we have an innate fear of elevators because they too often stop halfway between the floors and present us with the option of traveling to a faraway magical land. But we can be more pragmatic. Because the architecture of the department store is all about circulation, and hence the circuit, it not only makes the best model to understand metaphor's relation to the unary trait, and hence all cultural formations' relation to psychoanalysis, but it integrates architecture's theoretical interest into Lacanian theoretics as a whole. As a circuit, it is nothing less than the death drive, even to Freud's point of combining Thanatos with Eros by presenting a popular culture representation of Nirvana, a place where all your shopping needs, hence all your desires, are met in the form of an architecture of the other, which has floors, where the subject is able to waste a lot of time buying things she or he does not need. The department store's ability to convert the death drive to the consumer impulse via the two voids, one of space and one of time, to the existential question of lack as the same as surplus, takes us to what Lacan did for hell, the inferno that is simultaneously a Hieronymus Bosch pleasure dome, the land of jouissance, and symmetrical difference, a torture for every sin enjoyed. This is the place of metaphor, where Lacan presents us with an algebraic occasion to cancel each sin of metonymy with a punishment of suppression, beneath an S that we suspect is also the S, ES, or id, the subject prior to being barred, who puts into parenthesis the unary trait signifying the ultimate signified. This is the S double prime that puts an end to the back and forth of the game. It gives us back the real rule book that had previously governed the back and forth with an unknown logic, the X. We can now return to the question of why metaphor functions as both a formula for the origins of the subject's alienation of speaking from being, and, in a highly concealed way, represents the role of topology in this alienation. Reading from left to right, a new signifier, a metaphor, replaces another, and at the same time signifying chains are created that appear as a linear string of one metonymy after another, but are pulled by a mysterious gravitational force into a circle that, however hard it tries, cannot close, but creates a series of spiraling, repeated failed attempts, which in Lacan's terms, we know to be the way the aim actually causes the goal to move out of position. The result of this failed circling is the production of metaphor's real, the unary trait, indicated by a 1 that signifies a little S double prime that terminates what Dan Collins says is an endless search for new signifieds. In contrast to definition by punctuation, which fails to find its end stop, definition by the cut finds what cannot be found in parallax experience, but can only be found in projective geometry, namely the Object Petit, which replaces the mysterious X at the center of this torus of signifiers, and becomes the signified itself, which in light of its relationship to repetition can be called an isonomic point. This is where Ariadne's thread actually leads us. As with Lacan's mathemes for sexuation and discourse, quadration leads us back to the form of the torus. This is not what you might think, the donut or bagel round with two voids, but the fundamental polygon that is hardly ever named as such by Lacanians, but which Lacan names and applies correctly. This is a diagram of divergence and convergence if we draw it correctly. That is, if we pair the red and blue vectors twice to spread outward from repetition and then converge on suppression. This corner, designated by the Roman numeral 4, is where Lacan separates the two propositions, I don't think and I don't speak, inversions of Descartes' I think, therefore I am. The first inversion produced repetition as the demand the subject makes for the other's recognition. Instead of the ego subject's claim to be thinking and speaking as an ego, an I, psychoanalysis gives us an impossible real, that speaking and being can never do anything but alternate, like the isonomic boundary. Lacan's version of Ariadne's thread is the constant tension that pulls the opposite spaces closer to make proximity into over-proximity. So our only possible response at the number 4 position is to suppress one signifier by another. We recognize Lacan the magician because we ourselves are puppet masters, anguishing over the tangled lines that relate our happy effigies to our anxious others. Lacan's theories involve so many cuts, so many threads, all in the name of that mysterious substance jouissance and our endless attempts to lie about it. My argument is about how topology is absolutely essential to understand jouissance in the form of the little a letter, the letter that always arrives at its destination, but as a palindrome of the original. We have ways to push Lacan to the limits, where his me-dear, or halfway manner of speaking, meets its other half. These will always be where the two halves separated as the broken parts of the tessera join without joining along the katagraphic cut. If we stick to the science that makes this cut a line of proof, we will always recognize the cases of instrumental convergence in ethnology, the arts, and human behavior, where the little a will present us with a topology, a form. Though we think we can see this form, the little a will be the part that escapes our look, and that escape will always take us down to the basement of our analytical department store, where there will always be bargains galore.